Hey art nerds, today we're going to be painting this beautiful watercolor illustration. I'm going to show you guys some fun techniques for wet into wet and opaque watercolors. And I'm going to have a list of the most important colors used in this tutorial down in the description below, so please check that out. The materials we're going to be using today are two different watercolor sets, my daily driver set, which I've talked about in the past, and then my bonus Naomi set. We're also going to be using a small ceramic palette, several synthetic mix and natural hair brushes, paper towels, and I have my watercolor illustration secured to a piece of chipboard, and you guys can see I have loads of tape and clips holding it in place. This illustration was printed using my Blue Line Canson printer. I've talked about that quite a bit in the past, and I'll have a link down in the description below where you can learn more about the printers I recommend for comic and watercolor use. And I went ahead and I penciled it. And almost all of these supplies can be found at your local art supply store, but I will have links in the description in case you would like some additional help. Now, what you guys can't see in that cup, it is a Faber-Castell Click watercolor cup. I never drink out of it because it doesn't look like a drinking cup, and inside it's got a paint puck to clean the bristles of my brush while I paint. So by popular request, I've actually decided to show my palettes for the duration of this watercolor painting rather than zooming in as I've done on prior tutorials. And one of the first things I did is I used some clean water. I know you guys saw me mix up a wash of yellow, but I'm using clean water to paint in the hydrangeas, and this is going to encourage wet into wet blending. And this illustration was printed on Blick Studio Premier Cotton Rag watercolor paper. You guys probably hear Bowie meowing in the background. So one of the first things I'm doing is I am using one of Holbein's opaque pinks, and I want to say it's Brilliant Pink. I'm also using Vertiver Blue, another Holbein color. These are both somewhat opaque, and I am applying them very lightly just to the tips of the hydrangea. And something I love about hydrangea is if you get a soil that has a mixed pH, you're going to get hydrangea blossoms that come in all these different beautiful colors. And then I'm using Turner's Lilac color, and in the center of each blossom I just put a little bit of a cool yellow in the center and allow that to kind of blossom out wet into wet. So while that dries, I have a wash of Sennelier Ultramarine, Deep Ultramarine Blue, and I'm going to use that to begin establishing some of the shadows on Kara's dress here. Now, I want to have a really bright, cute yellow dress, and to do that, I'm going to want to do an underglaze of our ultramarine blue to establish those shadows ahead of time. And the apron she's wearing is white eyelet lace, so that kind of works well with already establishing the shadows. We're going to use this ultramarine blue as our shadow color for the whites in this illustration. Once that had a chance to dry, I went back over it with another light wash of ultramarine blue, just kind of darkening some of the shadows and tightening some of the shadows up a bit. I'm also going to apply some of the same ultramarine blue shadows to the tops of Kara's eyes. So since I'm working on volume 2 of 7-inch Kara, creating additional bonus illustrations and illustrations that can be used to promote the book, as well as watercolor tutorials that can be used to promote the book. This is one of those pieces. I've been kind of working through my backlog of illustrations that always seem to get put on the back burner because I'm busy teaching classes or I'm working on the comic pages themselves. If you guys are interested in learning more about 7-inch Cara Volume 2, I have a Kickstarter mailing list you guys can sign up for, and it's got lots of great behind the scenes information. So I mixed up a very light wash of yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet, and I'm using that as Cara skin tone. This is a favorite mix of mine for lighter skin tones. It works really well. So you can sign up for the mailing list. You guys will find a link down in the description below. You guys can also read the first 6 chapters for free at 7inchcara.com or 7inchcara.tumblr.com. Again, I'll have those links in the description. And my comic pages span almost 10 years of artistic growth and development. So chapter 1 looks quite different from our current chapter 6, and I have all the way up to chapter 8 with a bonus chapter painted. So if you guys love seeing how art develops and how artists grow over time, it's kind of like a nice little time capsule for that. So what I'm doing with Cara skin is I'm leaving just a little bit of white rim lighting. That would be kind of the lighting close, or rather the white of the page would represent the lighting, and I'm kind of doing that towards the tops of her arms and the side of her face. And you guys can see how the wet into the wet with the flowers has developed. So what I'm also doing is I'm going back in with a darker variation of the colors. So for the pink flowers, I'm using, I want to say Kusakabe Opera Pink, and I apologize, that might not be quite on camera. It's in that second palette down at the bottom that has a lot of opaque colors. For the blues, I'm using both the Vetiver Blue as well as the Sennelier Deep Ultramarine. And then for the lilac, I'm using a mix of Turner Lilac with, I want to say, M. Graham's Rose of Ultramarine or Ultramarine Violet. I can double check for that and have that in the description below. But it's a really beautiful sort of purple color that sediments out really nicely. And when you're working with opaque watercolors like this, one of the keys is you don't want to do too much glazing on top of it, and you don't want to do too much color mixing. You want to leave the colors as they are. So to add a little bit of shadow to the individual petals, I just lightly traced around them using that ultramarine blue wash that we mixed up for her dress. And now I'm starting in on her dress, and I thought doing kind of a yellow plaid would feel really bright and summery and very vibrant. So we're starting with a really, really light wash, and I'm just establishing some of the stripes now. We have broader stripes on the skirt itself and narrower stripes on the top, and I'm just kind of following the contours of the skirt and the top. And I talked about doing surface design in one of my Power Hour live streams a long time ago. And those of you who missed the Power Hour live streams, it's kind of a twofold problem. I would love to bring them back. One of them is this channel has been marked as for kids, and that was a decision I made after much consideration, but it greatly limits what I'm able to do and what I'm able to offer on the channel, including chat during live streams, which just kind of kills the fun of doing live streams if I can't talk to you guys. And then one of the other problems is my main desktop computer that I use for streaming has died and has been dead for 2 months, so I can't really stream even if YouTube were to fix that problem. So I miss getting to do streams with you guys. I miss getting to learn and explore things with you guys. Unfortunately, it's just kind of out of my hands right now, but I would love to bring it back. And I do apologize for that buzzing noise just now. Usually I put my phone on Do Not Disturb. I forgot before I started recording the narration. That was Joseph messaging me to tell me that actually my computer has only been down for 2 weeks, but it feels like it's been down forever. So now I'm going into the stripes. You guys can see this a lot better using that cool yellow mix. I've mixed it a little bit more saturated, and I believe it's a Sennelier yellow, but I could not tell you guys off the top of my head. And when I record these tutorials, I encourage you to paint along, but what I really want you guys to do is to put your own spin on things. Don't worry about using the same colors I'm using. Don't even worry about using the same material that I'm using. Just kind of sit back, enjoy, use this as an excuse to paint or to try something new or to learn a new technique. So once our first set of lines dried, I'm going over them with another set of lines, and my goal is to develop sort of like glazed darker patches where the two lines overlap. So I wait for the first set to dry before I apply the second. With this yellow, the glazing isn't as striking, so I'm going to go over and paint in the individual squares where the two stripes cross, just to kind of further that look. And I do apologize, it looks very fluorescent. That's just the weird lighting in my room. You guys can probably tell from the beginning when I showed you guys what the finished piece looks like, and you can probably tell at the end what the finished piece looks like, that I'm not using any fluorescence for this piece. And just in general, I try to avoid neon and fluorescent colors. The most I'll use is opera pinks and opera roses, because they are very, very light fugitive, because they are made from lake pigments. So those are dyes that have had a mordant added so that they sediment out into pigments, and dyes tend to be very, very light fugitive. And while most of my pieces are created for reproduction, they're not intended to last 50 years. I still would prefer them last longer than 2 years or 5 years, which can be one of the things that happens if you do not display watercolors that were painted with dye colors properly. And by that I mean out of direct sunlight and behind UV protective glass or in UV protective bags. And on that note, when I sell originals and when I sell commissions, I always put them in UV protective bags for my customers. So while I've been nattering on about that, I've been adding additional layers to Kara's skin, and one of the ways I handle her skin tone is I try to get 2 or 3 layers with the base mixed skin tone, allowing the layering and the glazing to develop the color, and then if necessary I'll mix the color darker. Sometimes I need to do a little bit of color matching off camera, but I've actually gotten pretty good at being able to remix it darker just by eye. But that's years and years of painting experience that's allowed me to do that. I also want to point out for you guys that this video has been time-lapsed several times. I spent about 4 hours, including the dry times, painting it one evening, and it's been condensed down into 30 minutes, so you guys can imagine how much was edited out and how much time it took to actually paint this. And I'm pointing that out because a lot of less experienced artists tend to get down on themselves. They call themselves slow artists, but they're not. And I think it's because they're really comparing themselves to time-lapse videos, and they don't necessarily understand that those videos have been time-lapsed because they may have only been time-lapsed like one time, so like twice the normal speed, which is not quite fast enough for our brains to be like, oh hey, that is definitely time-lapsed. It's just fast enough for us to think, oh, that artist is really competent and they really, really know what they're doing, and they just move really fast. So I try to disclose to you guys when I time-lapse things, just so you know. So for the stem on the hydrangea, hydrangea are kind of a favorite flower of both my grandmother and my mom. They've had a lot of them around their properties over the years. So hydrangea stems are kind of this almost silvery brown gray color. So to achieve that, I mixed a little bit of M. Graham's burnt umber, I want to say, with a little bit of Daniel Smith's beautiful undersea green to achieve kind of that desaturated greenish brown. So at this point, I'm starting to add some of the shadow on Kara's skin as well as some of the blush. And I started with the blush, and I used just a little bit of Winsor Newton alizarin crimson, which is a little redder than I would really like. I usually like a pinker alizarin crimson just in general. but I'm using Winsor Newton's Alizarin Crimson to add blush to her cheeks, her lips, the tops of her eyes, underneath her jawline, her elbows, and her fingertips. And then using maybe just a little bit of clean water to kind of wash that out and to kind of take it down a little bit. Because it definitely looks like very intense blush if you don't kind of blend it out a little. Earlier in the tutorial, I also added kind of a rim of the Sennelier Deep Ultramarine around Kara, and that's just to kind of help place her in the illustration, so it's not just like watercolor on stark white paper. And I've really tried not to overwork the flowers too much. My focus has really just been on tightening the details rather than adding a bunch of details or adding a bunch of additional lines. I wanted to keep that wet into wet vibrancy fresh, and I didn't want to tone it down too much with additional details. So on her dress, I went in with a warmer, darker yellow, and I just added some stripes on the, I guess, crosshairs, I'm not sure what to call it, on the plaid, just to add a little bit more definition to the plaid itself and to add a little bit more detail. And I do apologize that I am so pulled out right now. I'm doing that so you guys can see the entirety of my watercolor palette and you can better understand what colors I'm using for my mixes. So at this point, I've mixed a little bit of mauve. I've heard some people pronounce it mauve. I've been told I've been saying it wrong my entire life and saying it mauve. Please let me know in the comments below if it's mauve or mauve or mauve or where you're from. I know there is some dialectical differences in the pronunciation, but I've mixed that with a little bit of Daniel Smith's Naphthalide Maroon, which is one of my favorite really warm, rich reds, and I'm using that to kind of paint the shadows on Kara's skin. So generally when we're painting shadows, we're using contrasting colors, but with like yellows and with skin, you really want to go a little bit warmer than you might normally go because these are really vibrant things with a lot of lively color, and unless you really want to desaturate it and gray it out, you're going to want to go for kind of a warmer mix than you would normally go for. And kind of keeping with the colors used in the hydrangea, I am using the M. Graham Ultramarine Violet. I mentioned earlier that beautiful, slightly saturating purplish color. And I'm going to shade it a little bit with a dioxazine purple from Core. And Bowie has again decided to grace me with his presence, which may mean the headphone jack gets pulled out, or you may hear random meowings in the background. That's just his way of saying that if you guys enjoy the work I do, you can help support it on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. He is a boy who likes to eat Nutro, and your support on Patreon definitely helps me pay for some of Bowie's Nutro needs. So at this point, the skin does look a little bit overworked. One of the things I like to do, especially when I'm painting Kara, is I like to add all of the details, or almost all of the details, to her skin, because some of the colors I use for her hair have a tendency to reactivate if you put a wash next to them. So I find that for me, when working with lighter colors, like skin tone colors, especially in comparison to like hair, which often when I paint it is darker than the skin tone, it's best if I just go ahead and I do the blush layers and I do the shadow layers first, and then I go in and do the hair after it's had a chance to dry. I'm just going back in with the ultramarine blue and kind of tightening up some of the shadows on her dress and some of the shadows on her apron and some of the shadows around her. Just continuing to develop my detail, to develop the shadows, and to kind of tighten things up a little bit. When I work with watercolor, even though I tend to work kind of tight just in general, I'm not as loose as some artists, and I would love to work looser. I acknowledge that I work too tight and sometimes it gets muddy on me. But I try to work from loose, filling in big blocks of shape, to tight, adding details at the very end. So at this point, I'm just kind of noodling around, adding additional details, maybe adding more shadow to Kara's skin, trying to clean things up, maybe adding additional layers of skin tone to Kara. You know, just kind of developing the forms and the lighting. So using a clean paper towel and some water, I just wipe out one of my wells so I have a fresh mixing surface. This is one of the reasons I do like using ceramic palettes, is they're very, very easy to clean. And when you see me stop like that, it's because I'm pulling cat hair out of my brush. See, Bowie makes his presence known even if you guys don't get to see him. And you guys could see I added another layer of skin shadow using the skin tone I'd mixed. And now I've added a little bit of Venetian red, which is this really nice, rich earth tone. It's one of the colors I like to use for the base of Kara's hair since she has red-brown hair. And I'm using a natural Kolinsky sable brush. I believe it's a Winsor Newton Series 7 brush. And the reason I'm using that is it allows me to get really sharp highlights in her hair. And I do apologize that my hand is covering everything I'm doing. That's so frustrating. I'm so sorry about that. But you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. I'm trying to leave some of the white of the page as highlights. And to do that, I use these gentle kind of flicking motions, and that's where a stiffer natural hair brush really works well for this. It really allows me to focus on the mark making rather than just kind of filling things in kind of a color by number style. And I noticed as I moved away from mushier brushes, I could focus more on my mark making and less on just filling things in. So now I'm going to mix that color a little bit darker since it had a chance to dry. I'm going over and giving it a second layer, this time filling in less than the layer prior. That's a #1 tip for doing highlights. And again, I apologize that my hand is completely covering what I'm doing. It's such a small area. So that's layer 2 on Kara's hair. I usually do about 4 layers. A looser wash of the Venetian red, a thicker wash of the Venetian red since it's such an opaque color. Then I'll use Van Dyke brown. I may go back in with the Venetian red because it's an opaque color to kind of pull back on some of the highlights or pull back on some of the dark shadows in the hair. And then finally I use sepia just to kind of add those final details to her hair. And you guys can't really see it, but I am using the Venetian red to add freckles to Kara's skin. And then I've got my Van Dyke brown kind of mixed in the corner there next to the Venetian red. Again, I apologize, you cannot see it. And I'm using that to kind of fill in some of the shadows on her hair. Now I do have videos where I'm able to bring in the camera much more because we're not focusing so much on what colors I'm using, but we're focusing more on the techniques. So I would highly recommend you check some of those out. I'll link them in the description below if you're actually interested in seeing the mark making techniques I use when I'm rendering highlights and when I'm coloring in hair. So that's what her hair looks like when we have the Van Dyke brown layer rendered. And I have been doing so much watercolor painting in February between Kara's birthday and Valentine's Day, and then just trying to get through the backlog of sketches and illustrations that I've created over the years, or that I'm creating specifically for volume 2. And I've been sharing some of them on my Instagram. You guys can check those out at instagram.com/natosoup. But of course, they don't quite look as awesome as they're going to look in the finished printed volume 2. So I am really looking forward to being able to hold volume 2 in my hands. It's going to be twice as thick as volume 1, twice as long, twice as many comics, because chapters 5 through 8 are just about twice as long as all of the chapters in volume 1, since we're finally getting into the meat of the story and Kara and Naomi are really starting to get to know one another, and we're getting to explore both Kara's world and Naomi's world and see things from different viewpoints. I'm really excited about that. And the Naomi bonus chapter is also twice as long as Small Blessings in volume 1. So I'm actually really excited to have a substantial volume of comics out. I'm going to be really excited to have 2 volumes for sale, and I'm really excited to be able to share more of Kara's story with more people. I'm really looking forward to the Kickstarter and getting the book out, and I hope you guys who enjoy my art will consider supporting me in that endeavor. Not only by considering backing the book and getting your own copy, but also by telling other people about the project, especially people who are looking for great all-ages comics that champion friendship and cover family themes in a thoughtful way. And it seems like while I was chatting about 7-inch Kara and watercoloring many comic illustrations, the piece itself has progressed quite a bit. So I've already added the sepia layer to her hair, and I'm going in again. The way I watercolor, it requires a lot of layers to really build things up to the saturation that I like. I do love lighter, airy watercolor styles, and that's something I would love to practice in the future. So I'm going in with that red-violet color we mixed using mauve and naphthalide maroon, and I'm adding more shadow to her skin, kind of tying in with what I was just telling you guys. I really love lighter, airier, sketchy watercolor styles as well, and that's something I'd love to focus on and play with and experiment more in the future. I've done so a little bit, and I've shared some of that here on the channel, but I would love to do it more because it has this freshness and this vibrancy that I feel like my more rendered, more mannered watercolor illustrations start to lose. So we have zoomed in. I'm using sepia to add more details. So I've switched over to a smaller watercolor brush. We're still working with a natural hair brush. And I use the sepia to color her eyebrows, to do her eyelashes, and I do that all in brush. I used to do it in color pencil because I wasn't as experienced with watercolor. I wasn't as confident with handling a brush back then. And actually, my hands used to shake a lot more than they do now. My hands have actually gotten steadier, which is really nice. So I've been able to switch away from using watercolor pencils and then activating those with water to make it look like I painted them on the page, to being able to do most of my detailing and my outlining with watercolors, which is something you'll notice if you compare pages from chapter 1 and chapter 2 with pages from chapter 6, 7, and 8. You can definitely see that there's a lot more confidence in how I handle watercolors. So at this stage, I'm kind of inking with watercolors. I'm using really, really thick mixes, almost like dry over wet, basically as thick as I can get away with, and it still pulls a nice clean line. So I use the ultramarine blue to kind of outline her apron and to outline the eyelets on her apron so you can actually see them. And then I'm going in underneath her dress and adding the same ultramarine blue, not only to kind of create a drop shadow, but also to create more delineation on the dress. And I've also done that with the evaporated, more saturated skin tone. You guys can see that kind of, it's like almost at the top of the palette. It's that thicker, almost orangey color. So now I'm cleaning out the center of the palette. I'm going to apply some white gouache for highlights and details. And I do not particularly like gouache as a medium by itself. I don't do a lot of gouache painting, but I like using white gouache and titanium buff gouache to add highlights back into my illustrations to help add in contrast and to kind of help add delineation and clean things up. So I'm using a small natural hair brush with a little bit of water. We're looking for the consistency of cream. So when we handle gouache, we're handling it much thicker than we would with watercolor, where a little bit goes a really long way. And I'm using it to add highlights back into her hair, to add highlights in her eyes, to pull some highlights on the hydrangea blossoms, to add highlights on the petals so that they kind of stand out from one another and we're creating a little bit of depth, to add some white highlights back into her apron. And then I'm also adding some white detailing on her dress, just some little white hash marks to kind of further create our plaid pattern on the dress. And I know my hair keeps getting in the shot. I am in desperate need of a haircut, but I've been so busy painting and teaching classes and working on volume 2 that I haven't really made time to get a haircut. So hopefully I can schedule one really soon, because all this hair is really getting annoying. At this point, my hair is about as long as I draw Kara's hair, and I don't know how she can do it because it is so annoying. I wear my hair in a ponytail every day just to get it off my neck. Kara girl, how do you do that? In Louisiana, where a 7-inch Kara is set, it would be so hot and humid. It would just stick to the back of her neck and be so gross and annoying. Oh well, I mean, I guess if that's what you've chosen, that's what you can live with. So I've added little white dots to her shawl, and then I'm going to go over that just a little bit using the ultramarine violet just to kind of tone those down and to add some shadow into them. All right, guys, we are just about done. We're just going to need to remove our tape. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this watercolor tutorial. I'm going to have all of the products that I used, as well as additional useful tutorials, in the description below. You guys can also find links to my Instagram, my Patreon, and to 7-inch Kara in the description if you guys would like to check that out. I am removing the washi and the blue tape that were used to secure this watercolor illustration to, it's a piece of chipboard from the back of a watercolor pad. So that's what I'm using just to kind of hold it taut so that it doesn't buckle as I paint it. And I want you guys to note when I'm removing masking tape, I'm removing it at a 90-degree angle away from the illustration itself. So there we have it, our finished watercolor illustration. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me today. Hopefully this was helpful, useful, and informative. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully you guys enjoyed getting a peek at the palettes that I use. The one on the right is my Daily Driver palette, and then the one at the bottom left is my bonus Naomi palette that has a lot of really bright, saturated, fun colors that I usually go for when I'm painting Naomi. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and hopefully this inspired you to reach for your own watercolor and brushes and get painting. Have a great day, guys. Bye!